All right, everybody hear me okay? Good? Yes? Awesome. All right, well, thank you for joining me today. It's an honor to have the opportunity to share with you. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the options that exist for schools, both with and without Google. We're going to talk about some things that you can use today, even if you are not already a Google school, and also hopefully give you a path to becoming one if you are not already on board with the Google ecosystem. So before we get started, we're going to start off with the obligatory who am I? My name is Christian McDonald. This is my wife, Caitlin. We got married this summer in the midst of COVID. We actually had 2 wedding ceremonies, which is a little bit non-traditional, especially in our circles. But we had a COVID wedding with just our family, and then once the COVID restrictions lightened up a little bit, we had a larger ceremony. And we have been dealing with the COVID things just like everybody else has, and it's been very eventful. So anyway, this is my wife, Caitlin, and we live over in Fruitport on the west side, just north of Grand Haven. To give you some history on me, I graduated from Andrews University with a bachelor's degree in biology in 2014, and immediately following that, I worked as a high school science teacher at Grand Rapids Adventist Academy, and also took over all of the technology at that school as well. I was there from 2014 to 2017. In 2017, I continued on with educational technology and IT consulting, continuing to support Grand Rapids Adventist Academy and some other schools in the conference as well. In 2019 to 2020, I worked at Andrews University in the ITS department, doing higher ed IT, which was a lot of fun. In 2020, continued on with my biology focus, graduated with a master's degree, just defended my thesis within the last month. And now at 2020, looking onward, my plan is to continue to support the mission of Adventist education through technology. So, returning to at-home learning, this is not a question of if, but when, and several of our schools already have returned to at-home learning. And if you're blessed to not have returned to at-home learning up to this point, the question is not if, but when. With the uncertainties of COVID, we are not guaranteed of any future at all. And really, the schools that are going to be the viable schools, the schools that are going to survive through this time, are going to be the schools that are prepared for at-home learning, and that is going to adamantly require technology moving forward, as we have all experienced at some level over the past 7 months.
Four plus 1 is
16. How many pints of iced tea are left in the pitcher?
Times 10. So, wait.
You want to show us the continents and the now?
It's not going good. My mom is getting stressed out.
Is it big deal, Shelly?
Mama's tired.
I like.
So starting just quickly by breathing in.
I never thought I'd say this, but I kind of miss school.
So teachers, y'all the gift of people.
I thank you so much for what you're doing.
Their investment into our children is beyond what we can even imagine. Appreciate all that you do.
So yes, teachers, you are awesome. And I think this has opened up an entirely new insight to parents as to what we do and just how important we are in the lives of their kids. So if you feel stressed out, just remember that the parents are just as stressed out too. So we're all sharing in the stress here. Before we get started in talking a little bit about Google and some of the things that you can do, I want to kind of go through a timeline of some of the things that we do at Grand Rapids Adventist Academy And it's sort of, if I don't know if you're going to be able to make it to Daniel's talk in the next session. He's going to go into a little more detail into some of these tools. But just to show you, I'm going to talk a little bit about them and hopefully whet your appetite there. In 2015, we made the decision to completely remove all of our traditional computer labs. We had 2 computer labs at the time that were aging and were right on the edge of usability. We completely removed those computer labs, which opened up entirely new spaces in the school, extending our library space and also our upstairs chapel. At that time, we also deployed one-to-one Chromebooks. We knew that we needed to supplement that loss of the computer labs with one-to-one technology. And the Chromebook platform and the Google platform were the winners in our eyes as opposed to some of the offerings from Apple. We deployed Google Suite for education, and then we also deployed GoGuardian for admins and also their teacher product. GoGuardian for admins is their content filtering and monitoring solution. So this filters content both at school and when those devices move home. It also filters content there as well. And GoGuardian for Teacher is their premier classroom management suite, which allows teachers to actually monitor and ensure that students are on track and on pace actually in the classroom setting. But these tools also are really great for at-home learning as well. This talk is not about GoGuardian. I just wanted to show you a little bit about what we're doing at Grand Rapids. In 2016, we stumbled across the Clever portal and the Clever badge platform. This also facilitates a really important aspect to a successful technology program, which is usability. Getting students on as quickly as possible to decrease that initial cost to entry that teachers have to write a check for every day they use technology. The quicker that we can get students on and logged in and on task, the more effective the technology program is as a whole. And Clever has a really nice integration with Chromebooks that allow students to log in, younger students to log in with a badge that has their name and a QR code. So instead of the students having to remember usernames and passwords, which is, as you get younger and younger, that becomes harder and harder. The students just open their device, they hold up a badge in front of the camera, and it logs them in automatically. In 2017, we continued to expand the integrations that we were doing with Clever. Solutions like Brain Pop, Vocabulary Spelling City. There's other tools that you might be using as well. Clever actually has integrations with these e-learning platforms, and you can also do single sign-on with those solutions as well. So when the student logs into their device, not only are they logged into the device, but they're also logged into the software that you might use in the classroom. This is a real challenge, though, for small schools, and I have been a very vocal advocate for the small schools, especially in the Adventist world with Clever. Clever markets their product as free for schools, but when you actually talk to software vendors, you quickly realize that the cost is placed on the vendors, and they want you as a school to have a minimum seat count. BrainPop is probably one of the best companies to work with in terms of integrating with Clever, because they charge one fee that's a flat rate for the entire school, and they honor the offering through the NAD, and it's very affordable. Vocabulary Spelling City, they require a minimum seat count, a minimum number of students. So those are the two that we integrate with, and it's really nice because that data goes from RenWeb to Clever, and then it's automatically rostered in our e-learning software, so the students just log in and click on their application, and they're logged in and already rostered with their teacher in the classroom. In 2019, GoGuardian began to integrate with Clever, which we use that for automatically rostering students and placing them in GoGuardian for Teacher classrooms. And then just within the last few weeks, we took the data that already existed in RenWeb, built integrations to actually extend this out into GoGuardian for parents. And GoGuardian Parent app actually gives parents direct access to their students' online activity reports and also additional filtering controls while at home. Because especially now with at-home learning, we have to consider parents as team players. Not only in the delivery and the consumption of lessons and content and assignments, but also in their safety online. If we're sending students home with devices, we need to make sure that our parents are absolutely on board and our team players in that department. So, what are some of the hallmarks of successful technology? Number one, it must be routine and it must be transparent. Okay, when you're thinking about the technology, not the most effective. The technology needs to be secondhand, it needs to be routine, and it needs to be absolutely transparent to what you're doing in the classroom. Again, it must be accessible, it must be readily available, and you've seen that some of the things that we are doing at Grand Rapids focuses on that as a goal, making it accessible and readily available. So easy login for students, but also having the classrooms, as much as we can, with the budgets that we have, automatically rostering and automatically putting students into these software platforms with very little, if any, intervention from the teacher and the student. These successful technology must support the curricular goals and help the students to effectively reach their goals. It must be dynamic, meaning that it must be continuously integrated on, innovated on, and trained on. So, for example, a solution that worked last year might not work this year, and especially now with COVID, with the landscape changing so quickly, we must not resist change, where change has to be embraced, and we must constantly be looking at ways to integrate the technology, to innovate on what we're doing, and also be willing to say, you know what, I might not know how to do X, Y, and Z, and to seek out training, whether that's a Google search or attending a breakout, or even pursuing other options that we'll talk about later. And finally, we must emphasize online safety, cyber citizenship, and most importantly, a Christ focus above everything else. So, I want to get some feedback before we go on any further. What did technology utilization look like in your classroom before the COVID-19 pandemic? And then an extension to that is, how has that changed today? And you can either chime in with a chat or even unmute and chime in if you have something to share. Anybody have anything to add to that? Either via chat or... Awesome. Okay, so we're getting some feedback here. Emily says, before Chromebooks, Google Classroom utilized infrequently GoGuardian setup. After COVID, Google Classroom used daily as a base for all instructions and assignments. I like that word base, and you're going to see that one come up too. I use that term, home base, really, to make sure that students know where to go. Alan says, I was using Google Classroom for some of my classes before COVID-19. Rachel, my students could use technology in the classroom, but on Zoom it is different. Alan, then I went to Google Classroom for everything after COVID-19. On Zoom, my students have internet at their house. Yeah, that actually is a really so internet access at the home is a real challenge. That was something that we experienced at Grand Rapids too, and thankfully, if you're still experiencing hardship in that regard, Rachel, I would recommend contacting your local internet service providers. I know that Comcast in the greater Grand Rapids area had offerings that were either free or very affordable for families that were impacted by the pandemic. Brandy, Google Classroom is used daily now after COVID to be ready for at-home learning. Fantastic. All right, so let's continue on here with our presentation. And let me get this going again. I have way too many things open. All right. So thanks for the feedback. That really helps me to scope in a little bit on how the landscape looks like here in Michigan. So let's talk about G Suite. Again, one of the things that I want to be aware of too is that maybe not everybody that's listening today has access to G Suite for Education. There is some setup involved in that, very minimal cost. But even if you don't have that now, I'm going to show you some things that you can take home and really implement tomorrow if you really wanted to. But G Suite's going to be our focus today. So some of the prerequisites for G Suite, we're going to talk about two different paths. A path with G Suite for Education and a path without G Suite for Education. We're going to talk about the limits of one or the other, and also talk about where you want to be really moving forward if you're not already there. Let's see, got another chat coming in here. Let me just quickly check that. Internet doesn't go to their house. They get internet with data on their phone, but they don't want to use that data for their children to use computers in the home. Yeah, that was a challenge. We've seen, in the circles that I've been in communication with, some schools actually had hotspots that they would actually purchase through the cell phone companies and actually issue those along with devices if families had either no internet or no device or neither of those things. Let's see, we use Google Classroom and Google Meet daily. Internet connection is a continuing challenge. Yeah, internet connection is definitely a continuing challenge. Again, I would recommend contacting your local internet service providers and seeing what they have to offer. Even now, you might be surprised at what options are available, and even hotspots through your local, through your cell phone companies, Verizon, AT&T, that sort of thing too. So let's talk about some of the prereqs for G Suite. Two paths, both with and without. Path 1 is where you really want to be. This is Google's premier solution for schools. It's required really for GoGuardian, Clever, Google Classroom, although you can sign up for Google Classroom with a personal account. That's really not where you should be, because that's actually a violation of Google's policy. Google Classroom for non-adult students requires G Suite for Education because there's additional steps involved in coming up to compliance with the safety of minor children. It does require some IT involvement to actually set up, configure it, and maintain it. It does require a domain name, which is very inexpensive, $10 to $20 per year. G Suite for Education, though, the base is free. So if your school already has a website and you already have a unique domain, really it's just a matter of signing up for G Suite, getting approved as a school, and signing up and getting your student accounts created. But additional integrations on top of that with Clever and GoGuardian and all those other things does add in complexity that requires some IT involvement to maintain that. Path number 2 is where you can be today. Okay, not all the Google products are available without Google Suite for Education. But there's still a tremendous amount of functionality that can be realized even with personal Google accounts. However, this path really should only be considered a temporary solution as more of a transitionary period to getting you to G Suite for Education. So these are the two paths that we're going to be juggling, and we're going to focus on path 1, and then we're also going to show you what you can do if you're not already there yet with path 2. So this question was sort of already answered in the previous question, so I'm going to kind of gloss over this. I'm not going to bother to read the chat. But does your school use G Suite for Education, and if not, what has prevented you from adopting it? If you are not using it yet and you would like to, my contact information is on the last slide, and I'm available actually for consulting if that's something that you're interested in. But it seems like many of you are already using it, so that's awesome. So the first thing I want to talk about is managing a classroom, a virtual classroom. And again, a classroom website really should be your number one goal. If you don't have an online presence, a familiar space that your students and your families know where to go for information, this needs to be your first step. A classroom website can provide a familiar and a safe space, very similar to your physical classroom, that can serve as a home base for your students and families. Your students and your families need to know exactly where to go. Juggling text messages between families and emails and whatnot, that can be effective for small schools, but it really becomes untenable when you have this influx of information. Families can't find meeting links for Zoom or Google Meet. They can't find the information that they need. Train your families and your students to go to a home base, either a Google site or a Google Classroom, or even you can even use both of those things. You need to be consistent and prompt with updates and communication. This extends obviously outside of technology and at-home learning, but students and families should be trained to check the classroom website daily for assignments, meeting links, activities, announcements, etc. A well-defined online presence alleviates a lot of anxiety and those frantic emails and text messages from parents, especially those few minutes before that Zoom meeting is supposed to go live or that Google Meet meeting is supposed to go live, and they can't find the link or the password's not working, or they have no audio or whatever. Provide them the resources and the directions in advance that they know where to get to that information. That will cut down tremendously on the anxiety and the franticness before the class starts. Google Classroom is a fantastic solution if you are on G Suite for Education, so that primary path. But if not, Google Sites is available for personal accounts. So sites.google.com, you can create a Google site, and you can even scope that in and actually limit who can even access that site. So if you collect Google account email addresses from your families, you can actually lock down your site to just those accounts, so that you feel a little safer about posting meeting links and that sort of thing on your Google site. But you don't need to have Google Suite for G Suite for Education to use a Google site. And some schools, some classrooms actually use both. So they have a Google site, but then on their Google site they have links to their Google Classroom because they feel that some of the additional customization options and some of the more enriched features of Google Sites actually is a really good augmentation for their Google Classroom. So some classrooms use both. But you have an option if you're on G Suite and if you're not. Both of those options are available, and they both work really, really well. So let's really quick, I saw some chats coming through that I want to address here. Let's see, we have G Suite. It took a lot of work to set up, but it has not been convenient because Jupyter works well. Yeah, so let's see, let me make sure I'm reading that correctly. We have G Suite. It took a lot of work to set up, but it has not been convenient because Jupyter works well. Yeah, so one of the things that I have been working with, because I primarily work with the secondary schools and RenWeb, is making it simple for the data as it is processed, as it's enrolled, as your registrar and your principals move students around in classrooms, getting that data out of RenWeb to inform all of our other tools. RenWeb actually, within the last, I think the last year or so, they have their own learning management system, or LMS, that sort of fits in the same category as Google Classroom. That is already available. So if you're on RenWeb and your classrooms are already rostered with RenWeb, then your students are already on again. But again, the other challenge though is that currently RenWeb, the password that your students would use on RenWeb is not the password that they would use on G Suite. So you have that disconnect again that's not really, it's not making it easy when students have 4 or 5 or 6 different passwords for different applications. The goal should be to consolidate that to as few passwords as possible. And that's one of the goals that I've been working on for the last 5 years at Grand Rapids, is taking, and consolidating this down so that students have as few things to remember as possible, that teachers have as few things to remember as possible to get them on board, again, to decrease that initial burden. If students and teachers can get onto it quickly and effectively, they're more inclined to use it. Looks like Emily was asking, do you think having a Google site in addition to Google Classroom is helpful? I do. When I taught at Grand Rapids, I had both. I had a Google site and I had Google Classroom. I felt that the Google site had a lot more capabilities in terms of what kinds of content that I could post. And again, I'm going to show you an example of a really clever, friendly Google site that I found preparing for this talk. But yeah, I had both. I posted my syllabi there. In many cases, it was sort of redundant. I posted the same information in 2 places, but there were some things that I felt like I couldn't do effectively in Google Classroom that I could do with Google Site. Again, not every classroom is the same. Your needs are going to be different. I think the real takeaway, though, like Emily was saying in the chat earlier, is that your students and your families need to know about a home base. They need to, and I don't think email should be the home base. A text message should not be the home base. You need to have a well-defined presence online that is that home base, that your students and your families know where to get information. And if they need additional help, obviously making yourself available is one thing, but an online presence now is absolutely critical. So going back to the managing a virtual classroom, on the left, here's an example of a really clever Google site and some of the things that you can do. This is Mrs. Richardson's math class, and you can see that she's gone above and beyond using some of the other tools that are available with Google, like Google Drawing, to actually create a really nice background and then to actually put icons above those areas, meet the teacher, classroom check-in, a link to her Google Classroom, etc. And you can see that in many ways, especially for young learners, this feels a lot more friendly than a Google Classroom. Google Classroom is great, but it really has it's very focused on announcements and assignments, and not so much on the other aspects of the classroom. They're both really great, and they accomplish their different roles, but I think in many ways they can be used together. And this is an example of that. Okay, so let me go to the next slide here. What about Google Classroom? If you've attempted to log into Google Classroom within the last year or so with a personal Google account, you've probably seen this notice because now they've actually opened up Google Classroom for use without a G Suite for Education account. And it's a little bit confusing as to why Google's doing this. It's really focused on adults and also for homeschooling situations and whatnot. But really, if you are a classroom with non-adult students that is represented by a school, you should not use Google Classroom. If you want Google Classroom, you need to go through the appropriate channels and sign up for it, because you're going to have to answer this question. Honestly, I've read and understand about the notice above. I am not using Classroom at a school with students. Okay, you need to make sure that you are not doing that. But there are other options that exist, like Google Site, that you can still use. If you do have G Suite, Google Classroom is an excellent solution. It's not the only solution. It has tight integrations with Google Meet, which is Google's version of Zoom, Google Calendar, and Google Drive. And there are options that are available for actually automatically rostering students from Fax or RenWeb and Jupyter to automatically put them in classrooms. That's an advanced thing. We're not going to talk about that. If you're interested in those options, let me know. There is a cost there, but it does exist. And you can use this together with Google Sites for more customization options. Let's see, anything else in the chat here? I'm just checking that. Nope, looks good. All right. So again, that base analogy that Emily pointed out, we're going to use that here as well. So again, your home base should be a Google Site or a Google Classroom. Your teachers need to know, your families and your students need to know exactly where to go for information. This should not be a last-minute thing. And if you're using this effectively, even before you re-posture back into at-home learning, that transition from in-school traditional delivery and at-home learning should be seamless, because students are already familiar with the process. It just is a matter of where they physically are. Are they going to the Google Site or the Google Classroom at school, or are they doing it at home? And really, that's a minor detail. But training them to go to a very familiar place is really the number one goal here. I've defined 3 bases to kind of build on this analogy of a baseball field, and the first base is Google Meet. Google Meet is Google's video conferencing solution that you might have used. I know that Zoom got a lot of initial publicity in the space when COVID first started to really ramp up in late March, early April. Zoom came under a lot of flack for some privacy concerns, and for a while there was even question as to whether or not Zoom could even be used for schools that had, again, non-adult or minor students because of some of the policies that Zoom was kind of buried in their terms. And there were some schools that even raised question as to whether or not this was conducive with minor students. Zoom has since, obviously, they want to be competitive in that market. They have made changes to that regard. But if you are a G Suite for Education school, you have an agreement. Either your principal or your IT staff have signed an agreement, and really that should have extended to parents as well. And Google Meet is really a good option because that falls under that umbrella of Google's offerings for schools. So there's two different options with Google Meet for schools. There's G Suite for Education under that first path. There are some limitations, but they're very workable for schools. The maximum meeting length is 300 hours. So you can actually start a meeting at the beginning of the school day, and you can let it run all day and not worry about having to start and stop meetings and have students find your next link. The participants is capped at 100. Google does have a new enterprise education offering that costs, and it bumps that up to 250, but you probably don't have classrooms that are larger than 100. And again, there's no recording options. Zoom does have local recording options. You can record locally. But I'm going to show you a technique that you can use to actually record your classroom meetings even when you're using Google Meet for free. And I'm actually doing that right now to record this. I might edit it and post it on YouTube later. Personal accounts. So with Path 2, the meeting length is capped at 1 hour. Now, for a single classroom session, a single instructional period, 1 hour is not too bad. The participants are still capped to up to 100. But how do you work around some of this stuff? Well, Google Calendar can be used to automatically schedule recurring meetings. Again, this is going to require that your meeting links are easily accessible. All right. Again, so using Google Classroom if you have it, using Google Calendar or Google Sites if you're using that too, to make sure that your students know, okay, here's the link for period 1, here's the link for period 2, because if we're on Path 2, we're capped at an hour. So we need to make sure that students know where to go to transition between those meetings. And if you do that and you make that information accessible and students know where to go, it can work. Again, though, your goal should be to move to Path 1 if you're not already there. How do you record meetings? So one solution that you can use that's free is called OBS Studio. OBS Studio is a tool that's really popular in the streaming YouTube space. It's a tool that allows you to connect lots of different audiovisual inputs and take that and then kind of re-deliver that out either as a stream on YouTube, or you can even create a virtual camera that you can actually then assign in Google Meet or Zoom or whatever other video conferencing tool that you're using. So for example, what I'm doing here, I'm sharing my screen actually as my camera. So you might actually see the screen twice. My camera is actually my screen, but I'm also sharing it through Zoom. So I'm doing both. And I'm doing that because I wanted to record this for my own use. I might edit this and post it on YouTube. But the way that this works is you take your webcam, and instead of feeding it directly into Google Meet, you can feed it into OBS, and then you can record to your local computer. And you can also set different inputs in OBS. You can have your desktop as an input, other cameras as an input, and you can get really, really fancy. I'm not going to go into actually how to use it. If you want to learn more about OBS, hit me up with an email or a phone call, and we can talk about that. But you can actually use this to record to your local computer your meetings, even if you're using a video conferencing tool that doesn't offer free recording. So this is a really, really useful tool for recording meetings. Any questions, any comments so far in the chat? Cool. All right, let's keep going. So, again, emphasizing this concept of a home base with Google Site or Google Classroom or both. Google Meet to facilitate synchronous delivery, with students in real time. If you record your meetings, you can actually facilitate asynchronous recording or asynchronous delivery. So you record your lesson, you post it onto your Google Site or your Google Classroom, and then students can asynchronously, on their own pace, at their own time, go and get that content. The next base that I want to talk about is YouTube. YouTube is a fantastic resource for information. I am all about reusing information, reusing content. You don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel for everything. There is an immense library of really high quality YouTube videos that can augment any lesson that you might have. So we're going to talk about YouTube. But again, this analogy of coming back to the home base should always be at the forefront. Make it easy for your students. Let's see, I saw a chat come in. Let me realize that. My computer has very little space for storage. This is from Beth Stevenson. What is your recommendation for online storage of large video files? If you have G Suite for Education, you can post your videos on Google Drive, and Google offers unlimited storage. That is unlimited. So that is a great resource. Now, you're going to have some space on your local computer for actually collecting that file as you record it in real time. But once you have that file and you have done any kind of editing, post it to Google Classroom, and then it becomes a very easy embeddable link that you can post on your Google site or your Google Classroom. So yeah, if you have Google Drive, unlimited storage. I cannot emphasize that enough. Unlimited. I have a lot of stuff stored on my Google Drive. I think there are some fine print there, but treat it as unlimited. Very unlikely that you will ever hit a limit there in terms of, I think there's a limit on file size. I think it's like 2 terabytes. It's very large. So use that. You can even upload your videos to YouTube. Again, students and families are familiar with YouTube as a video content platform. You can upload videos to YouTube and set them as unlisted or even private, and then you can actually add Google accounts that have access to your video if you wanted to do it that way. But even if you post it to G Drive, they're still a player, so it's not like they have to download the file and then figure out how to play it. They can play it through their web browser too. So it works really well. So YouTube, let's talk about YouTube. Big fan of YouTube. This is probably one of the best ways to keep students engaged. I know that when I taught, watching a YouTube video about a topic in many ways was more interesting than me. And I thought I was a cool teacher. But students love YouTube. So there's really a lot of great content here. There's a lot of bad content, obviously, on YouTube as well. So obviously, make sure that you're reviewing what you're directing your students to. But there's a lot of great content. Some of the YouTube channels that I find really useful: Khan Academy, Crash Course Kids, Veritasium, Smarter Every Day. Veritasium, Smarter Every Day focus a lot on real-world stuff, real-world science. Smarter Every Day, lots of real-world stuff, like hitting the longest home run using a robot. Hitting a golf ball the longest using rockets, like stuff that really gets students excited about science. 60 Symbols talks about physics and astronomy. PBS, National Geographic. I'm a big fan of space. NASA, SpaceX. If there's a rocket launch, NASA always has really high quality educational materials, watching guides, and discussion points for getting students excited about science. Math, Numberphile, it's a great resource, especially for older students, as a lot of it is higher in math. Periodic videos for chemistry. Again, a lot of really good content. And again, I also recommend too that if you find video content that you really like and you want to use it for instruction, do yourself a favor and Google for pre-made lesson plans. Again, I'm a fan of reusing. Especially now, we don't have time for reinventing the wheel if a plan already exists. A quick Google search can save hours of time. And if not Google, then a site like Teacher Pay Teachers. Okay, do a search. If it costs a few dollars, that might be worth the time at least to bootstrap a lesson versus starting from scratch. So again, Google is your best friend there. Post links or embed videos directly into your classroom website or Google Classroom. Again, going back to this analogy of a home base, students should know exactly where to go. create a unique page for a lesson and have all the content right there for your students to grab and follow through, so there's no confusion at all. Videos can be a great avenue for class discussions, real-world science education, and a lot more. And again, YouTube is open access. It's available with Path 1 and Path 2. There are more controls with Path 1 in terms of tightening down what kinds of videos students can access. But at least with both paths, YouTube is absolutely available. Let's see, I saw a chat come in. Let me address that. I preview smarter every day. Sometimes I use languages we wouldn't want to use. I have not been entirely familiar with that. I know that Destin Sandlin is a Christian. I've always been very impressed by his rapport. But yeah, I mean, obviously, always preview your videos and don't blindly distribute them or even show them in class. That's a given. But thank you, Rachel, for that reminder on previewing videos. All right, going back to our analogy here of our baseball diamond. Again, our home base should always be a online presence, Google Site or Google Classroom, Google Meet for synchronous delivery, video conferencing, and if you use a tool like OBS to record your meetings, you can then post those for asynchronous delivery, which again, I think we really should be targeting for both of those, because obviously the ideal is to have our students engaged with us in the moment, but again, with illnesses and COVID and all these things, making our lessons accessible asynchronously, it saves us time as teachers. It also saves our students frustration and making sure that they are still maintaining and reaching the bar that we set with our students in real time. YouTube, again, really great content there, but as we've suggested in the chat, make sure to preview those videos to make sure they're on board with both language and the mission of the church and our schools. And finally, coming back around the diamond here, let's talk about Google Drive. Google Drive is Google's premier tool for collaboration. Think of Google Drive as really the analogy to the Microsoft suite. So Google Docs is to Word, Google Sheets is to Excel, Google Slides is to PowerPoint. This is your file sharing, your organization, and your collaboration tools. Google Forms is I think, an underused tool, sort of missed by a lot of teachers, but this is great for collecting student feedback, and there's even a quiz feature that allows students to actually take assessments, and if you're clever enough with the types of questions, you can even train it to actually do some grading for you. I've never found that to be quite useful unless it's for multiple choice or true-false, but that option does exist. You can use these tools to offer immediate revisions and edits on student assignments, collaboration with group projects, and I have always preferred this over emailing assignments. With assignments that are handwritten, which some of you are still using, as Brian was mentioning earlier with the scanning apps, direct your students and your families to apps that allow you to scan assignments in, especially if you're sending things home. But really, we should be focused on as paperless as possible. It allows a much more tighter and responsiveness in terms of feedback with our students. Google Drive has tight integrations with Google Classroom, and again, going back to the storage thing, unlimited storage. But it's still very useful with Path 2, even though I believe Path 2 with personal accounts is capped at 2 gigs. But that's actually only 2 gigs for files that are not native Google Drive formats. So it's files that are not Google Docs or Google Sheets or Google Forms. I don't believe those actually consume that quota. So there's still a lot of usefulness that can be realized even without Google Suite for Education. Let's see, I saw a chat come through. Let me address that one. Yeah, forums for spelling tests. That's great. Spelling tests, obviously, very binary if it's right or wrong. So you have to think about the types of questions that are being asked, if it's really conducive. But even if it's not something that can be automatically graded, you can still collect that and grade them kind of after the fact. Students enjoy drawings for art projects. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot of functionality that can be realized even if you're a Google school or not. There was actually another tool that I wanted to talk about that I didn't make a slide for, but it was a tool that we actually discovered at the end of, right at the edge of transitioning to at-home learning, and that was Cami, K-A-M-I. Anybody heard of that or used it? I did not see it in Daniel's list for the next breakout, so I might have a monopoly on that tool. Anybody heard of Cami? I don't have a slide for it, but I can kind of talk about it in short. Cami is a tool that allows students to annotate over PDF documents, which if you're familiar with PDFs are not typically editable, but this allows students to actually type in and annotate up PDF documents and then resubmit them. It's a really cool product. It's very affordable. I think we got the quote that we had for our school. I think it was about $6 a student if you're licensing your entire school. Otherwise, I think it's $100 per classroom. But that's K-A-M-I, Cami. Highly recommend it. It's really, really nice. Emily says it was very helpful. A workaround was to put a document as the background. Yeah, that is a workaround. To put the document as a background in Google Slides, and then students can type or draw on top of that. Yeah, that's a good free option. But Cami was definitely easier. We found that out too. Yep. But it was convenient because it was free for several months. Especially, it got us through the end of 2019-2020 school year. So yeah, good options there. I want to end off with additional training resources. I know that this is not the part of technology programs that teachers like to hear about the most, but it is something that is very important, especially when our schools are investing tremendous dollars in technology, which means your parents are investing tremendous dollars in technology. Your churches are investing tremendous dollars in technology. I think it is as stewards of that gift is training. Google has a first-party level 1, level 2 certification for educators, and this is very easy to go through. Besides the time commitment, and it's very affordable. So the certification is valid for 3 years. It is something that you can advertise on a CV or your resume, and I think schools that can say that their educators are Google certified, I think it really shows an additional level of commitment to not only the Google platform but technology in general. The certification is valid for 3 years. It goes into a lot of detail on way more than I can go into an hour in real world tenable, usable ideas that you can use in your classroom for ways to engage students with the Google Suite. The exam is 180 minutes, 3 hours. Costs $10. It's valid for 3 years. And most importantly, the training material is free. So there is no more investment than your time. And self-pacing it, there's something that can be realized at every level of this training. So don't feel like you have to do it all at once or continuously. If you feel like you need some additional advice, go there. This is the first party training resources for Google. GoGuardian. I'm sure that Daniel will mention this next in the next session. GoGuardian has GoGuardian University, where they talk about how to use the GoGuardian tools. Clever now has Clever University for talking about how to use Clever. So these BrainPop has tools, has training resources. Vocabulary Spelling City has training resources. If you're a school that you have these tools but you have not gone through any training, I really feel like we are doing a disservice to both to our students and also to the cost that was invested in obtaining these solutions. So make sure that you are considering that. Again, a successful technology program must be continuously integrated on, and trained on. These things do not stay stagnant. What worked 5 years ago probably is not working today. So make sure that you are on top of that as well. Let me check the chat. Let's see. I believe Jupiter lets students write on docs. Jupiter does now too. Beth says, approximately how many hours to complete? It's been several years since I've done that. It honestly depends a lot on how familiar you are with the Google platform at the onset. If you are already using it, you honestly can skip through it very, very quickly. I did the GoGuardian stuff about a year ago, and I went through the training material probably in an hour or two and took this stuff, and it was very, very quick. Let's see, Alan, why is the exam 3 hours? I think that's a cap on the maximum length. I don't think that's actually the full required sit time for the exam. They do have I think they have a cap on the how long you can sit on the exam. If I recall from that, it is proctored. Is it multiple choice? There are some multiple choice components, but I'm trying to remember too. I do believe there are some aspects where they actually create a virtual G Suite environment, and you actually have to create some materials that are then graded, if I recall. Yes, it is practical. Yeah, and that's part of why there's a fee for that, is that there is some cost on Google's end for running the examination process. So anyway, any other questions? We're right at lunch is right on us. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Anything that you find useful that you'd like a follow up on? Feel free to chime in, not only on chat but also unmute and talk, have a conversation. You're welcome, absolutely. I want to leave you with my contact information. Here's the link, by the way, to the training center. It's edu.google.com/teacher-center/training. How to get a hold of me? Like I said before, my focus right now is consulting with our Adventist schools in Michigan. So if you'd like to reach out to me, you can hit me up at cmcdonald@mced.tech. That's mced.tech. You can also reach me at Grand Rapids Adventist Academy at cmcdonald@graa.com. I prefer these two. I'm also on Facebook, that I'm planning on building that up with information. Right now, more focused on the IT side of things, but I'm probably going to post this up there as well. My cell phone, by the way, this is an order of preference. So if you want to get a hold of me, send me an email first, and then we can engage further. But if you want to send me a text message or give me a phone call, my number is there as well. So I look forward to talking to you. If you have specific technology goals and needs, I am available and look forward to working with you. Yep. Let's see. Thank you for a great presentation. You are welcome, Beth. Emily, thanks. Very practical. It had me create a Google site. Awesome. Beth, can we get your resource list for recommended applications? Yes, I've been recording this, so I'm going to make this available, the slides available, and also the talk available as well. Rachel, thank you. You're welcome. Brandy, thank you very much. Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we're gonna stop this breakout and break for lunch. So let me go back to my main camera. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Hopefully this was useful. My goal, I remember sitting in these and hearing about all the fancy things And in schools they don't have anything, they're like, yeah, this is great, but I don't have access to this. I was hoping to give you options if you don't have anything. So hopefully that was useful. So thanks for joining us. Enjoy lunch. I will enjoy lunch.